Hello, this is Political Dharma with Alan Zundell, and it is October 12th, 2024. And last week's show was October, 5th, I think. Thank you to the viewer who reminded me that it was not September, but it's actually October. I think I got a little confused because I just moved to San Diego from Oregon a couple of months ago. And I'll tell you, the weather here in San Diego is a lot like late summer in Oregon than I'm used to. So it is October here, but still pretty sunny and warm. I usually been doing updates on the presidential race, focusing on independent and minor party candidates. But months ago, I promised I would do some kind of assessment of these presidential candidates, and I've been struggling with how to do that. And today, I have found a way that I want to do that. I didn't want to simply say, who are these people, what is their background, and what are they promising, what kind of policy issues are they taking a stand on, because that doesn't tell you a heck of a lot. In terms of the minor party and independent candidates, it doesn't tell you why their parties have been able to build to the point where these candidates have gotten on so many ballots. And with RFK, it doesn't tell you why he's been able to build a coalition to get him as far as he did before he suspended his campaign. And in the case of the major parties, what the candidates say they want to do is usually not very detailed, and they won't necessarily follow through if they get elected to office. So they make a lot of promises and they make a lot of claims, but it doesn't really give you a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. So earlier this week, actually, I was talking about the development of the two-party system and the coalitions that form behind each of the parties, why they have to get big coalitions. And I thought that would be a good way to do this, to talk about the forces behind these. So let us start off with the Democratic Party in the modern era here, our current election, and our candidate Kamala Harris. So what are the kind of forces that make up the current Democratic coalition? And I'm going to give you this in very broad strokes because we don't have a lot of time for detail. And it's a generalization, so it's not all inclusive, but I think these are the main forces within the Democratic coalition that's helping it keep together and promote their candidate. Where's the money coming from? It's coming from big financial donors. And with Kamala Harris, that's important because it was when their big donors turned off the money spigot to Joe Biden that Joe Biden had to concede that it was time for him to step aside. And they started pouring money into Kamala Harris's campaign activities. I think she had a campaign committee from previous. Anyway, they started funneling money to her. So she was clearly the pick of their big donors, and they helped her get a big head start in replacing Joe Biden. She was their pick, in other words. Their big donors, I've divided into two broad categories. One I call the both siders, which is not self-explanatory, but by that I mean they give to both parties. These are the big donors in areas like major investment firms and big agriculture, big pharmaceutical companies, just huge corporations in general. And the military-industrial complex is another big one. And I can't omit at this point in time the pro-Israel lobby and the money that they bring to the table. These are all important donors, and they tend to give money to both sides because whoever wins, they want to have access to the candidate. Rich liberals is a different category here because it's people who have a lot of money but have more liberal values, so they will gravitate towards the Democratic Party and give their money there. The prototypical examples of these would be familiar celebrities like George Clooney or Oprah Winfrey, who have lots of money in the entertainment field, and liberal values such as feminism and elevating minorities and gay rights and abortion rights, all that kind of culturally liberal stuff. And so they share those values. They have a lot of money. Now, this is principally from the entertainment industry, not only celebrities like actors and TV performers, but also producers, directors, other people behind the scenes, and tech people, people who made a lot of money in internet work. Uh, Kamala Harris comes from San Francisco, which is just close, which is just north of Silicon Valley, where a lot of tech companies got started and are still established. So there's a lot of money there. People who are what we might call the West Coast elite, who have liberal values, and they tend to give to our Democrats. So she has connections in that world. From coming from California, she has both tech support and entertainment money, and she's also inherited Joe Biden's big donors from the both siders realm of this. All right, so who are the people who are most active in the party, who are actually professional Democrats in one way or another? There are political careerists and patronage seekers, and they overlap to some degree. Political careerists are people who have made a career in politics as office holders, like Kamala Harris, who came up through district attorney to attorney general to U.S. senator to vice president, and all the people who support a person's career like that. They're campaign staffers, the people they put into place when they take office to help them in their work, like legislative staffers, or people, in her case, it'd be lawyers that have helped her out, that she gives jobs when she was attorney general. So people who work to support candidates, also campaign people who usually specialize in one party or another, almost entirely. People who do polling, people who do campaign work, people who do get out the vote drives and organizing campaigns in different states. So these people have political careers, and they're well connected with people who make, who are the big office holders. And then there are patronage seekers. And by this, I mean there's a whole network of what is sometimes called the nonprofit industrial complex. All these organizations that promote liberal issues like environmentalism and feminism and abortion rights and gay rights and what have you, civil rights, they have people at the top of those organizations and on their staffs who are paid to do this work, and they prosper by having connections with Democratic politicians and foundations that are donated, whose donors come from that same rich liberal elite. So rich folks with liberal values give to foundations who promote policy issues and give money to organizations that work in these fields, and then they cultivate connections with Democratic politicians so they can do successful lobbying and also sometimes get government contracts to do their work. There's a lot of awarding of government contracts to groups like this, and they want to keep that money flowing. They do work with the poor, they do work in housing, they do work in environmentalism. So these are people that benefit from their government connections to get money for the organizations that they work within. All right, so those are the careerists, and that is the people that do most of the work in turning out the vote and in keeping the party together within the governmental realm, holding it together and moving it forward and setting its positions. But they're always conscious of the constraints of their big donors and always conscious of how far they can go before they run into the interests of those donors in areas such as regulation or taxes or other things that might affect them financially. Who is the mass base of the Democratic Party? Predominantly college-educated and professional people. Professional because they've gotten college educations. They have high trust in institutions like the mainstream media, the Democratic Party, legal professions, courts, the government in general, especially, or maybe exclusively, if the government's under their control. They have a lot of trust in the government to do good things if it's in the hands of the right people. And they hold liberal values in those same areas that I delineated, having to do with cultural issues predominantly, but to some degree with supporting causes for the poor and Medicare for all and stuff like that, things that would help people to do better financially because they trust in the government to run these kind of programs. So they work to, they would support going further that way. Now here's where the big divide in the party comes from. There are those that we might put into the category of supporting the Democratic establishment, meaning those careerists and the big donors, and are satisfied with incremental progress because they feel like the Democratic Party is the only realistic vehicle to promoting the kind of goals they believe in. So they're willing to compromise and say, well, if we can get a certain distance, if we can get a little bit further in environmental protection, get some programs that address the climate crisis, get programs that, in one way or another, move things forward, that's okay. Because as professionals, they're usually pretty well set in their career. They're not suffering extensively financially. They may feel precarious because their children are not doing as well, or because there's change in the economy constantly and they're never sure when they might lose their job or have to move, or their housing value might go down. So they sense that there is a need for an economic safety system, and they also have these liberal values. But they want to stick with the pragmatic route of trying to agitate within the Democratic Party because that's their best vehicle for doing this in their mind. And then there are the people that are further towards the end of saying we got to push farther because we're in a mode of crisis. With the climate crisis in particular, we got to do a lot better, or we're already seeing the effects of it in hurricanes and wildfires and stuff that affects everybody. And also we need to move further towards economic support because we see a lot of people in the country who are not doing as well economically, do not have the kind of health care they need, do not have the kind of good jobs they need, and they are turning towards the Republicans and supporting someone like Donald Trump, who promises solutions to their economic issues, even though the Democrats don't believe those solutions are very realistic. So there are those who want to push a lot harder. And here we could say we move into the realm of more progressive activists, spanning the spectrum from those who progressives call establishment and not progressive, who are satisfied with incremental progress, and those who want greater progress, like moving from Elizabeth Warren, who's a little more to the left side, to Bernie Sanders, who's even further there, to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is very far on that end of the spectrum, wants to move things a lot faster. And they are less interested in placating the big donors because they've taken more advantage of mass fundraising, especially through the internet and emails and ads on Facebook, wherever they can. So since they have a little more financial independence from the big donors, they're willing to move further, faster, and they're constantly struggling against the establishment, who is putting checks on them because they don't want to alienate their big donors. Now, I would put Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in that establishment group, as are most of the major Democratic politicians, because since the time of Bill Clinton, they've become very dependent on those big donors, and they are afraid that even, okay, the two theories are, the theory of the more progressive wing, is that if we do more to help ordinary people, we'll be able to build our coalition and get more voter support. But the theory of the establishment is that without big money to help us fund these campaigns and do all the ads and hire the campaign professionals, we're not going to be able to compete with the Republicans in the realm of how people are usually reached by media and commercials and that. So most of these, like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, are much more in the realm of they're dependent on big donors for their political career. They have not built as much of a mass base within the party. But once they get nominated, the party will go along with them because they feel like, well, okay, this is settled, this is the person, this is my coalition, we'll support them because we want to move forward. All right, so that's that. Now, this will be important when I get to the Green Party, because that progressive coalition, once you shade off into people who are disenchanted with the party, there's where you're likely to find a lot of adherents of the Green Party. Let me give you a quick update on how that coalition developed, because I said in my earlier video where I talked about the development of the Democratic Party, they were originally, way back at the time of Jefferson, formed of Southern Democrats who were represented agricultural interests, like the big slave plantations, and then the smaller farmers who owned their own land. And in the North, you had the Federalists, soon to transmute into the Whig Party, who were more involved in trying to develop commercial interests, like banking and transportation and trade policies that favored the development of early industry and trade between countries. So that was the opposition to the Democrats. The Civil War kind of settled this issue. The commercial interests had grown along with the growth of industry and capitalism in general, and the Southern Democratic Party was destroyed after the war. But then what happened is that there was rivalries in the North between business interests, and there was a reconstruction of the South that, I shouldn't use the word reconstruction because that's usually meant the Republicans who tried to give African Americans the rights to vote and the rest, but it was people who wanted to revitalize the South economically, and they instituted the system of racial suppression. The slaves had been free, but now they were sharecroppers who were very dependent on big financial interests, and they used racial divisions to try to keep wages down in the South to build up the industries there. So the Democratic Party had a coalition between the reconstituted Democratic Party in the South, which relied a lot on appeals to racism, frankly, and the Northern Democrats who were competing, who were business interests that felt they had lost out in government access. They felt like big banks, railroads, some industries had a lot of government subsidies, and they were disadvantaged in this race, so they wanted a way to get control of the national legislature and the presidency, so they joined forces with the Southern Democrats. That's what happened during the post-Civil War era. In the meantime, you had the development of the working class and the farmers going further west, like the Midwest out to the far west, farmers who felt like they were being exploited by the big banks and the railroads and commercial interests. So they started forming their own parties, like the Populist Party and the early socialist parties. Eventually, come the turn of the century, these forces became integrated into the new Democratic Party, which then had a coalition of working people, especially immigrants in the urban areas, like the Irish or the German or the others, recent immigrants. Germans have been around for a while, but there are always new immigrants working in the cities. So immigrant workers and Western agricultural interests, smaller agriculture interests, and some business folk, and the Southern Democratic Party, which always were able to deliver votes for keeping their system of racial subjugation in place. So that was the Democratic Party is evolving. Great Depression broke interest in any public support for the business interests of the Republican Party, and Franklin Roosevelt built the New Deal coalition based on these types of new classes that were coming into formation, like the working class. They did a lot of legalization of unions and the institution of support for workers, like unemployment insurance and business regulations, banking regulations. So it was more of a subjecting business more to government control and redistributing incomes to help poor people or people that were hurting economically, and to uphold the rights of labor unions so that workers could get better wages. So the New Deal was a New Deal, and it solidified this coalition for a long time. Coming into the 1960s, you had more change. The professional class, people who worked in middle management positions and professional positions within large corporations, and independent business people, lawyers, doctors, whoever, all these people with more professional orientation and liberal values, they were gravitating towards the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, there was turmoil over the Democrats incorporating civil rights at the time of John F. Kennedy Jr. I keep saying that, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. They turned towards the civil rights movement as a way of getting support from black Americans in these cities who had been Republican leaning, and the Republicans had been for civil rights for a long time, since the Civil War era. But they saw the opportunity to build a coalition with the civil rights leaders, and so they backed this. That means they lost the South. And under Richard Nixon, he made a deliberate strategy of using covert racial arguments to bring a lot of these Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. And this has continued up to the present day, where they have a racial subtext in a lot of their appeals. Let's see, where am I going? Oh, the final phase of this is when Clinton came to power, right? As I think I mentioned earlier, there was a replacement of union workers, blue-collar workers, with more professional class, college-educated. The reasons for that are various, but the more blue-collar workers felt like their values were not represented in the Democratic Party. They also felt like racial preferences and preferences for women were hurting them in a variety of fields. So I would say there was racial resentment, not outright racism necessarily, gravitating into the Republican Party. Actually, both. People that had legitimate resentments about how they felt their financial prospects were being reduced due to government support for previously financially disadvantaged groups, and overt racists, mostly from the South, but in other places, obviously, as well. So the Democratic Party had different coalitions going forward. They lost a lot of non-college educated workers, and they gained a lot of professional workers, and they started relying more on big donors. So where does that leave the Republican Party? And here the case I'm going to make is Donald Trump is not at all an aberration in terms of the kind of coalition that developed in the Republican politics from the same time. So let's go over to the Republican Party and Donald Trump. All right, what makes up the Republican coalition? First of all, there's the big donors, and as I said, there are big corporations and Wall Street investors who give to both sides in order to keep their taxes low and keep their special tax credit privileges, like for, what do they call, carried over income or something. I forget the exact phrase, but it helps investing firms and the people who work in them. And the big corporate interests, the military industrial complex, pharmaceutical companies, all the rest, they still stick with both parties, so they help Republicans as well. And independent business people, and here what I mean is people that feel like they rose up from their own bootstraps. You have a lot of people in rural or urban areas who are able to build up their own business and become quite wealthy in areas such as small manufacturing and retail chains and who else? I mean, real estate industry, and of course, who does that tell you? That Donald Trump came from that world of real estate, the so-called self-made independent businessman, at least in their own mind, who are generally less favorable to government regulation than the both-siders. The both-siders want to use the government to give them special privileges, subsidies of various kinds, but the independent business people are more anti-government because they see them as restricting the freedom of them to do business the way they want to do it, to pay people what they think they're worth, and to run their business without all these environmental regulations or other types of things that interfere with them doing things the way they think they should. So they're a big factor in the Republican Party, have been for a long, long time, and Donald Trump is a prototypical example of them. Who are the careerists within the Republican Party? Well, since a lot of their politicians actually come from the business world or labor, or not labor, what am I trying to say, the business world or lawyers, the people that hold the party together ideologically are mostly conservative intellectuals, and I would say they come from fields such as economics and private colleges like Christian colleges, where they talk a lot about cultural values and are worried about here we can say evangelicals and conservative Catholic intellectuals, especially the Catholics, because they tend to be better educated than evangelicals. They have a lot of people that talk about how the modern world is going to hell in a handbasket and why that is, and how we need to return to Christian values and even Christian economic thinking or Christian political thinking from way back when. They are interested in stuff like countering abortion and a lot of stuff that involves sexuality, such as reproduction and gender identity and gay rights and that kind of thing. Abortion, of course, is a big one. So the conservative intellectuals have this whole framework of defending these issues and talking about how the government needs to go in a whole different direction and have a whole different governing ideology. And then policy specialists, by which I mean people who work primarily in think tanks, but then when the Republican gets into power, they move over to government positions to help steer policy making. So there's a whole set of conservative foundations and think tank organizations that develop policy ideas like American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation and a whole lot of others, Cato, a lot of them. And so they cultivate people who have gotten educations in conservative type programs, and they help them to develop their intellectual firepower, and then they put them into positions in the government when these Republicans get into office. So who is the mass base? Who are the primary voters in this coalition? Well, you don't find a mass base of independent business people because they're a minority within the country. Most people, you do have smaller, very smaller businessmen, not the really wealthy ones, but the ones who are still trying to hang on with some kind of small enterprise, and there's enough of them that they can form a part of this coalition. But you have non-college educated workers who have gravitated towards the Republican Party since the time of the Civil Rights era, partially because these racial resentments that I mentioned earlier, partially over issues that feminism and abortion, the rest, they have more culturally conservative attitudes. Going to college tends to liberalize people generally, not necessarily. So they haven't been as exposed to that. They're also more rural conservatives and less urban centered. They, what else? Anti-communists. They tend to regard any government buildup as being socialist, and I would agree with them. It is socialist and orientated, only I don't agree that that's a bad thing necessarily. So they have suspicion of government, and then conservative Christians, of course. They were brought into the coalition by Ronald Reagan around that time to help build up the party. And so the big mass base really is non-college educated working people and rural people and conservative Christians. Those make up the main base of the party. Where does Donald Trump fit in here? He's obviously not a non-college educated worker, and he's not a Christian, although he has cultivated contacts with Christian conservatives. I think really where he came in is exploiting the racial resentments, which is not a new thing, but he made it a lot more overt, I think. By focusing on immigration as his primary issue, what he's done is he's appealed to these non-college educated workers who see their financial positions as being more precarious, and maybe they're losing ground in some ways. And by blaming that on immigration, he is promising to help them economically. At the same time, he's stirring up people who have resentments racially or outright racist. So at the fringe end of that, and here let me talk about some of the divisions of the party. The traditional donors and conservative intellectuals regard overt racism as beyond the pale, and so they'll try to tamp that down, and they have in the recent history of the Republican Party. But there's always been that element that gravitated from the Democratic Party of the, from times gone by, into the out of the Democratic Party of the South that had outright racial attitudes, and this is spread across the country, the racism, because it helps explain to them what has been going on. It gives them a larger picture of what's going on in the world, that we are, the white race is under assault from all these people of color from around the world and people that don't understand American culture and are not Christians. So there's that disreputable, from the standpoint of the more educated segment of the Republicans, and this shades over into the militia movement, which is closely associated with white nationalists and militias, people who use violence. So I would say that Donald Trump has also appealed to them covertly, and sometimes overtly, more so than previous Republicans. Previous Republicans like Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon or George Bush, even though they would talk at times about welfare recipients or affirmative action in ways that played on racial resentments, they tried to avoid being associated with outright racists like, say, David Duke of the KKK, who ran for office and thought he could get a foothold in the Republican Party, or Pat Buchanan, who took a much more aggressive stance in how these immigrants were not really American, didn't have American values. But in Donald Trump, this has come to more of a culmination, in my opinion, that he's appealing to people and stoking their belief that we're under assault, the white race is under assault, our jobs are under assault from these people from outside, and if necessary, we need to turn to violence. So incorporating the militia movement into their coalition and actively, even if using coded language, saying that he's on their side. So I'm talking about folks like the January 6th incident, where a lot of folks who had nothing to do with the militia movement, but those who were plotting how to escalate this and to break into the Capitol and use the threat of violence to stop what was happening. These were people who were organized militia movement people who a lot of them are now in prison. But here's my assessment of the two major parties, my main worries. Let me wet my throat a moment. Okay, here's my main worries of the two major parties. With Donald Trump, my fear is that if he gets into office, he will give pardons to these people from the militia movements and continue to use them to try to stoke violence and racial resentments, causing a lot of turmoil in the country and the escalation of violence. And then he will also use them as his shock troops to try to maintain office even beyond the election, which I think happened in January 6th. He was actively involved in that, in my opinion, and I think there's good evidence for that, even though he tried to cover it up. So that's my fear. This could go in a very fascist direction, and that's what worries me most about Donald Trump. Now, Kamala Harris, on the other side, what worries me the most is getting into World War III, which is as big a concern as anything else. And here, it's because of this connection with the Israeli lobby and the military-industrial complex. I should say that both parties have had a similar economic position, which is called neoliberalism, when there was a sense that the government had failed to manage the economy well during the 1970s. First, the Republicans started saying we need to scale back the government, and then Clinton came on board and said, okay, the Democrats are going to do the same thing, and it left corporations, global corporations, to start prospering under this deregulation regime. And so both parties still have their elements of that. These are the big funders, the big corporations that have global reach, and the big financiers who invest all over the world. These forces are used to having access to resources and workers in other parts of the world, so they want the United States to maintain its power in other countries, which is why I'm getting to the Ukraine war. In my opinion, the U.S. helped instigate this war. Just like the Middle East conflict did not start on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel, the Ukraine war did not start when Russia invaded Ukraine. These have longer histories, and they are connected to the long history of military-industrial support for both parties, the Israeli lobby's influence on both parties, and the global corporations trying to maintain U.S. hegemony economically, as well as using the military to pressure other countries. So all this, both parties have their elements of that. And my worry is that they're still present in the Democratic Party, and that the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East are leading us deeper and deeper into possible conflicts with major powers. China in the background, but Russia, obviously, in the Ukraine, they have nuclear weapons. Iran in the Middle East, they're funding a lot of these pro-Palestinian groups, and they have big army, a lot of wealth from oil sales, and connections now with China and Russia that they want to use to beat off Western influences and Western attempts to control the Middle East. And so getting in a big war with Iran could escalate as well. And this is where we're headed. And that's what I'm worried about, is that really the corruption in the party, depending on these big donors and being willing to back them no matter what, despite their own bases, reservations, and questioning, is what could lead us into very serious waters. I don't think the Harris is going to take the climate crisis seriously enough, and that's a big issue for me. So in a lot of ways, there's this existential feeling that either party is going to bring us into difficult waters. One other thing, though, I talked about Donald Trump becoming fascist. The Democratic Party is in danger of this as well, as anyone can see. For all their talk of democracy, what they've done, as you can tell watching my program, is they suppressed minor parties. They've been suppressing freedom of speech because they believe, since they're mostly college educated and they have trust in major institutions, they believe that alternative viewpoints that they regard as incorrect should be suppressed because it's stirring up political division, and Donald Trump is taking advantage of it, and he's a big danger to democracy. So they rationalize their own attempts to counter democracy. We have a candidate who was picked by big donors. We have attempts to control media platforms, social media, and control the narrative in the mainstream media. So again, you have attempts to suppress free speech and gain kind of monopoly on political party and suppress any movements that try to challenge that, like the Green Party or independent candidates. So both parties, to my mind, are very dangerous. They're going in dangerous directions, and it's a product of the underlying economic forces. All right, so who are these other candidates? I want to talk about Chase Oliver of the Libertarian Party, which is going to be on the ballot in almost all the states. Jill Stein of the Green Party, who's going to be on nearly as many ballots. And finally, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the independent candidate who's no longer running, but whose name is going to be on the ballot in the majority of states and has followers who may still vote for him, even though he's telling them to vote for Donald Trump. So let's talk about what's behind these. Now, here I feel like I don't have as much solid ground, especially in the Libertarian Party, because I haven't been actively involved in it and haven't paid that close attention to it. I've been sporadically paying attention to it, but not like the Green Party, where I was actively involved in it, and I actually wrote a book about the formation of the Green Party. And RFK's movement is so new, I can only rely on scattered news reports to get a picture of what's going on there, and from what I've seen in social media and the internet in general. So let's start with the Libertarian Party. Who are they and what's behind them? Now, these parties and candidates do not have a broad-based coalition, so they're a little more simple to explain. Libertarian Party is highly ideological. Libertarianism is a political philosophy which is based on free market economics and conservative economics who promote deregulation and small-scale business and getting big business corporations out of lobbying the government. Their role within the government, where they're getting special favors and special treatment, they want to get rid of that and just have this free market where everybody's playing on an equal playing field. So they're generally, the Libertarian Party means individual freedom, and they want smaller government. They want less interference in personal lives. Leave it to people to decide about abortions and gay marriage and all those kind of cultural issues. Leave entrepreneurs and business people free to run businesses the way they see fit, because it'll work out in the end with the free market rewarding those who produce things people want to buy and the punishing those who don't. Their support network is primarily think tanks that are funded by wealthy people. Now here, these are some of the wealthy donors who have more conservative values that I mentioned when I talk about Republicans. Some of them, like the Koch brothers, I think it's Koch, I think it's Koch. I hate to say Koch. I think that's how they pronounce it, but it sounds like I'm disparaging them. But they're in the oil extractive industry, which is highly subsidized by the government, by the way. But they have funded libertarianism as a way, not only because they genuinely believe it, especially the one brother who's still alive, because they genuinely believe in it, because they want to get government out of their business. They don't want environmental regulations, and they want to be able to amass wealth in the way they want. So they fund these think tanks, and the think tanks promote this ideology, and you have a lot of conservative intellectuals involved in it who are building the framework for this. And they're mass-based, to my mind, as far as I can tell. Seems to be mostly college-educated people who are more systematic thinkers. That is, they think in terms of systems like computer systems or engineering. So you have computer engineers and mechanical engineers and the types of people that think of things working as systems. That's why they're gravitated towards the economy as a system which can work on its own if it's left free to do it itself. So it's when they regard the capitalist economy as well designed. If the government would just get out of it, it would work fine. Who is Chase Oliver? How did he come out of this? Well, he's a younger guy. He's 39, I think. He's college educated. I haven't been able to find too much about his political major or his professional background. I do know he's in sales, and he's been in the restaurant industry and in human resources. So my guess is he was educated in business and had a lot of economics training. So this is where he would have been exposed to more libertarian types of thinking. He's gay, openly gay, so he would want the government out of his personal business as well. But the Libertarian Party is pretty small. Mostly it appeals to people on the basis of its specific political economic ideology, and that's where they are coming from. I got to wet my throat once again. And as you can tell, since they have major disagreements with the Republican Party, but some overlap with them, there is overlap in the economic sphere, where they want to have a more capitalist free market economy, just like these independent business people and the conservatives, some of the conservative intellectuals. But they are more, they're more opposed to corporate influence on the government because they regard it as an unfair advantage. So they are dissatisfied with the Republicans for that reason. They don't agree with the Republican Party on cultural issues like gay marriage and equal rights and reproductive freedom. And they also, I'm missing a third one here, that they disagree with the Republicans on, a war, the military-industrial complex. They see that as the government involved in favoring military companies that produce military equipment are lobbying the government, and they're getting all these privileged contracts, and they see that as driving war. So Chase Oliver, for example, who was the nominee of the Libertarian Party that you just saw his picture, he got into politics because he opposed the Iraq War, the United States invasion of Iraq in the the early part of this millennium, and then he gravitated to the Libertarian Party. So that's what they're about, as far as I can tell. And so if you're more gravitating in that direction and that appeals to you, I would say look into the Libertarian Party and Chase Oliver. What is the Green Party all about? Well, here I'm a little more familiar with them. And I would say their activists are not exclusively, but predominantly from the human service professions. Let's talk about Jill Stein, who is their nominee and has been their presidential nominee twice before. She was a physician, and she started out as a Democrat and saw how the environment was impacting a lot of her patients. So she got involved in trying to get the government to regulate and take more of an environmental stance. And then she saw how many politicians were bought and paid for by corporate money. So she started working on campaign finance reform, and one major bill that she had supported, she wasn't in politics, she was a physician and an activist, was overturned by Democrats in Massachusetts, her home state. So she got more and more disillusioned with the Democrats and turned towards the Green Party. A lot of Green Party supporters are college educated, and they have liberal values. So their support network, such as it is mostly people who work in these areas, such as environmental issues and reproductive freedom, feminism, civil rights. I think I said environmentalism is a big one. Obviously, it's called the Green Party. So that, and there are people who have been involved in areas that do that are not really business oriented. So lawyers who are not corporate lawyers or business lawyers, health professionals, educators is a big one. Her running mate in both this and the last election she ran in 2016 were academics and also people who are part of the black resistance movement. So they covered two bases there, civil rights and they're activists, educated activists. So, activists, academics, policy-oriented groups, and the college-educated liberal value type voters who are more disenchanted with the Democratic Party. So this is where the progressive movement of the Democrats shades off of the people who have finally said the Democrats are not doing enough and I'm disillusioned with them for one reason or another, and they move towards the Green Party. There's a lot of variety within the Green Party, but I think overall you could safely say that they range from progressives in the sense that we're familiar with it, to more social democrats who are more explicitly socialist goals, moving from Bernie Sanders, who wants to see more government programs like government-run single-payer health care, and he would support other types of government programs as well, I think, to those who do want to see the government more actively involved in helping people, et cetera. So more social democratic in the socialist sense that don't completely do away with capitalism, but push things as far as you can as far as the government regulating business and helping people and redistributing income. So they would be the people who are on the further end of that spectrum who have given up on the Democratic Party because it moves too slow and is making too many compromises and is very beholden to their big corporate donors. And this is why someone like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is attacking the Green Party because she sees them as a threat to her whole strategy. If they are attracting people from her edge of the Democratic Party, that means they don't have the strength within the Democratic Party to push more in the direction she wants to go. So there's a lot of animosity there between people who feel like the Democratic Party is the realistic, pragmatic vehicle, and the people who say, I've given up on the Democrats, we've got to try to build an alternative party and change the political system that supports them. So this is some of my background. I had been a Democratic Party supporter for a long time, but I became disenchanted with them over issues of war and peace, more against military adventurism abroad, and want to see more help for people who are in economic distress, etc. And that's why I gravitated toward the Green Party. But I also have some values in common with libertarians, because if you want to know anything about me, I'm more of on the side of the anarchist socialists. So socialists have had a big division between the anarchists and the more Marxist-oriented strategies. I shade more toward the anarchist end or libertarian socialism, but I'm not going to get into all that. This is getting plenty long enough, I would suspect. And so finally, who are the supporters of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? Where does he draw his support from, and how was he able to build a coalition so quickly? And this is the one I'm on the, it's just impressionistic on my part, because there's, as far as I know, there's not a lot of academic studies or histories of his movement because it's so new. So sociologically speaking, I'm doing some guesswork here based on evidence that I've run into. Who are the people behind this? The activists that are involved in it? These are political independents. I'd say they are people who have become disillusioned with both major parties, mostly over corporate influence over both parties, and they have become non-affiliated, but they're still engaged in politics, and they're looking for vehicles for how to move the independent politics forward. That is, politics that is outside the two-party system. They've been looking for vehicles for this, and so a lot of them have gravitated to Kennedy. If they're not strictly libertarian, or they don't go as far as the Greens do, they saw this as kind of a middle ground vehicle, I think. What is the support network? Well, this is the alternative health movement, I think, is the main vehicle for building support for Kennedy. And by that I mean people who have been exposed personally or in their family to these conditions of chronic disease and illnesses that the mainstream medical establishment does not seem to be able to deal with or understand. And so the suspicion is that they are caused by some environmental factors and possibly vaccines. Now, I'm a little skeptical of the vaccine piece of it. I'm a lot skeptical of it still. Haven't been persuaded of that, but I do think there's a lot of environmental factors, and I have been impacted in my own family by, not me personally, but people close to me, by chronic disease issues that the health industry has not been able to contend with, and in fact, they seem to want to blame you if they don't have a solution. And I've seen how, both my wife and I have worked in mental health, me as a counselor after my career in academia, and her as a behavioral health nurse, and we've seen how a lot of patients, their illnesses have been related to stress, financial stress in particular, but the pharmaceutical company just keeps pushing pills on them. So in working with people with mental health issues, so-called, we have had to contend with the pharmaceutical interests competing for these clients where we think they need both counseling and concern from the larger society, as well as better economic conditions. So the mass base here, who are the voters who are interested in the Kennedy movement? Well, I'd say it's primarily people that no longer trust their major institutions. They become distrustful of the health industry. They become distrustful of the government. They become distrustful of the two major political parties, and I include myself in all of these. And so they become more what? A lot of them are people who are searching for explanations of why this corruption has happened and what's going on behind the scenes. So this would include people that are attracted to conspiracy theories, which I think is a pejorative term generally, but as far as I'm concerned, there have been and there are conspiracies in the United States. There's conspiracies within businesses to get, like the pharmaceutical industry. There's the big company that was getting people addicted to fentanyl, and they saw that as a business opportunity, so that's a conspiracy. And there are, I do think, having looked into it, that their former CIA head, Alan Dulles, was involved in the Kennedy assassination, John F. Kennedy, and the FBI and law enforcement was involved in Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. So there are, I think there are conspiracies, and there's a lot of people who doubt the official positions coming out of the government about these types of things, and are willing at least to look at alternative explanations. It's not that they're, at least in my case, hardcore, we believe that there is bad things going on behind the scenes, but it's more of a suspicion. Things don't add up, so they're trying to figure out what is going on behind the scenes. And I think these are the people that have been attracted to Kennedy. They're disillusioned with the major institutions. They're looking, because they don't believe in political parties as much, they're looking for a leader who is not associated with the parties, who is kind of independent, that would bring them out of this. But since Kennedy has moved over to supporting Donald Trump. A lot of them have become scattered and gravitating to other parties. Those who have gone to Trump are, of course, those who already had something in common with him in the terms of they are distrustful of the media, they are distrustful of the Democratic Party, they are distrustful of the government in general. So there's some overlap between Donald Trump's coalition and the RFK coalition. So it's easy for a lot of them to move from one side to the other and set aside their reservations about the larger ecosystem of the Republicans, that is the big corporate influence in the party and that aspect of it. And that's part of it. Donald Trump has been trying to break himself free from their influence as well. He's tried to buy them off by promising them tax breaks, and he's also tried to consolidate his own base of power without needing them so that he is a little more free to operate in the ways that he wants to. My worry about RFK is that in supporting Donald Trump, he's backing somebody who has ulterior motives and who is not necessarily going to stick with them if Kennedy is not totally 100% loyal. That's Trump's history. So there, okay, that's with RFK, why I've not followed him into the Trump camp. I've already explained why I'm suspicious of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So where does this leave me in my assessment? Well, as I assess all these candidates, I've come to turn back towards the Green Party myself. I am more in alignment with their values and their policy positions currently than with the Libertarian Party, although there's some overlap with me, and they're more familiar to me. And I think Jill Stein is a more credible presidential candidate than Chase Oliver. She's got a lot of professional experience. She's run for office several times. She has a lot of connections with people that she could get into positions of the government. And I have some issues with libertarian philosophy in general as far as their being pro-capitalist. I think a major restriction on personal freedom is the fact that we have businesses that are run by their investors and workers who actually do the work and make the business run are under their control. So to me, there's a contradiction between how capitalist firms are run and personal freedom. All right, so that's it for me. This is my assessment of the parties. This is where I'm gravitating. Not a lot of good options as far as I'm concerned, but that's where I'm at. And next week, don't know what I'll be doing, but following up on the presidential elections until we get to the actual election and can analyze what actually happened. Thanks. I suspect this has turned out to be a very long segment. I hope you were able to stick with me to the end. I appreciate you viewing, as always, your likes, your subscribes, your comments, your donations. And please return again. I've been losing supporters since Robert F. Kennedy Jr., since I turned away from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as much, and I could use your continued support. So thanks a lot. Bye.